Hello everybody, Ben Woodruff here. In this video we are going to be talking about macaws and parrots in the American Southwest and the Mexican Northwest. This is talking about the Macaw Trade, macaw upkeep, all things macaws. This video has taken a lot of work. This is taking years and years and years of personal experience training and working with macaws and archaeology in the field, and months of research and trying to compile this information together. So if you can hit subscribe, I very much appreciate it. So just a really quick overview, and then I'm going to talk to you about how this video is laid out, because this is supposed to be a tool where you can kind of go to the part that you want to know about. You can watch the whole thing if you want, but it's going to be divided up. So just really quick. Macaws were kept in the ancient Southwest by 600 AD at least. That's the earliest, at least for sure by 600 AD, macaws were kept in the southwestern United States. They had tremendous symbolic and spiritual meaning, rivaling even eagles. Now, I'm going to put a link in the description of this video to a video I did just covering eagles. I've worked with eagles myself for years as well as macaws, and I bring a lot of light into the archaeology of eagles being kept by people at Chaco Canyon. So you can check out that video if you like. But macaws, anciently and to this day, carried even more weight than eagles did as far as their spiritual worth. To this day, they still carry incredible spiritual representation to the descendants of these ancient peoples. Now, how these birds were transported and kept elicits a deep conversation, which I will address and discuss. That oftentimes just gets just blasted over. People don't really go into depth about that and thinking what it actually takes. Eventually, this macaw trade evolved into aviculture and captive breeding, which I will also discuss, ancient captive breeding at Paquime. I am making this video from the position of someone who has studied and worked in archaeology for many years, as well as someone who has raised, bred, trained, and flown countless macaws and parrots, as well as all kinds of species of raptors. I intend to bring perspectives that have been lacking from other videos and publications and lectures out there. So again, the hope is that this can be a resource. I would like for people to be able to share this video and have this be, some of this information is so vital to understanding the macaw trade and the whole story of the American Southwest and the Mexican Northwest. It really is vital to understanding. And so I'm making this video, I'm trying to make it as complete as possible for that purpose. So this video is broken into topical segments. It is meant to be an educational resource. I'm hoping people will share this video so the information becomes more common knowledge. Again, feel free to take a look down below in the description. You can click on whatever these things you need to know about. But if you listen to the whole thing, you're going to get incredible information. So first thing we're going to start off with is what parrot species were kept. Now, a lot of times people don't go into the biology of these species. So I've recorded different segments in this video at different times. So if it changes and if it's abrupt or if the sound's a little different or if I'm wearing different clothes, that is why. So this first is a segment that I've pre-recorded about what parrot species were kept in the ancient American Southwest. So let's go ahead and take a look at that clip. The thick-billed parrot is a spectacular and very interesting species of parrot. This is a parrot that ranges throughout the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. Historically, this species also ranged into Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Texas. Pretty impressive. So that was historical times that was recorded, but it has had a vast reduction of range and numbers. It is now classified as an endangered species. It's endangered now as of 2018. The estimates are that there's only about 1,700 wild individuals in Mexico. Now, one of the things that has been done is captive breeding programs have been successful in breeding and then re-releasing these into the wild. Efforts have been made to reintroduce them into Arizona. These events have been catastrophic failures, not because the birds could not readapt to their ancestral homeland, but because of the fact that goshawks killed them. Northern goshawks are a predatory species. They do hunt birds, and they almost immediately find these loud parrots and kill them and eat them, which is kind of sad. But the question remains, how is that possible? As goshawks have always been in those mountains, and there used to be thick-billed parrots in those mountains, how is it that the goshawks did not kill those parrots off in earlier times? We don't know the answer to that question, but it's something to think on. These parrots, these thick-billed parrots, they live in temperate pine forests, and the elevation is usually about 4,000 feet above sea level to about 11,000 feet above sea level. That's pretty high, and it gets quite cold. In fact, it often snows, and these are parrots that can handle the snow. They've learned to adapt quite well to it. They prefer the warmer weather, but they've adapted to the snow. And now thick-billed parrots mostly eat pine nuts. There's a lot of fat, and pine nuts are very nutrient dense. It's an incredibly nutrient dense food. So where a lot of parrots, they'll eat seeds, but they'll eat a lot of fruit. Well, there's not a lot of fruit up there, but a pine nut is the fruit of a pine tree, and it is so nutrient dense that they can live almost exclusively off of them. We see that for the most part, the species of pine that the thick-billed parrots target are the Mexican white pine. That's their preferred food source. But they also will eat from Douglas firs and Apache pines and Chihuahua pines, yellow pines, and they will also eat acorns and pine buds. So the buds are the little flowering part that comes out of the pine tree originally, and they'll eat that. It's another nutrient-dense food source. Now, these species have been observed climbing upside down on branches covered with snow. So even though they can handle the snow, they prefer not to soak their feet in it. Now, birds have a lot of blood vessels running through their bare feet to keep them warm and to keep them cool. So if you get those feet wet, you can cool down. And if you cover those feet up with fluffing up your belly feathers, you can warm up those feet. Snow throws a monkey in the wrench right there and kind of throws that off. And so what will happen is these parrots will hang upside down if there's a lot of snow on top of the branches to climb over to access pine nuts and pine cones to get their food. Now, they nest in hollow trees. They can do some hollowing of trees themselves, but they're not like a woodpecker. You know, they can clear stuff out. They have very powerful beaks, but really they need an old growth hollow tree. And that is one factor that may be causing part of their decrease in numbers is a lack of suitable nesting opportunities. A lot of the old growth trees are gone in their traditional range, and that could be causing a lot of issues with having places to nest. In captivity, they have been documented living as long as 33 years, which is a substantially long life, and they are very good talkers, so they can absolutely learn whatever language, English, Spanish, ancient Native American languages. They can learn to speak very well, and they absolutely learn what they are saying. So this is something that in ancient peoples would have factored in to their great value, as it's almost a magical bird. The military macaw is a proper-sized macaw. Compared to the thick-billed parrot, this is a much larger species. Military macaws live in west-central Mexico, southward all the way down to Argentina, and even as far south as Bolivia. The range is very spotty. So there's kind of these weird mixed populations here and there. They're not just spread throughout the length of their range. But these are large and proper species. I've worked with several military macaws and even hand-fed them from babies and imprinted them working in that industry years ago. So I love these birds. They're very good to work with. Now, the wild population is currently listed as vulnerable. So they're doing okay, but they're at risk at becoming endangered. The estimated current population is that there is somewhere between 2,000 to 7,000 breeding pairs in the wild. However, in captivity, these things breed incredibly easily and are very common in the pet trade. A lot of times they're considered to be the most commonly bred. These and blue and gold macaws are the two species that are most commonly bred as far as macaws go in the pet trade. So they breed very readily, very easily in captivity, and there has been some reintroduction efforts because of this as well. Now, this is among the longest lived parrots on record. You always hear stories of how long parrots can live. You hear parrots living over 100, and you hear different things. We don't know for sure because there's a lot of anecdotal stories of a parrot being passed down generation to generation. But on record, for sure, military macaws have been documented as living to at least 60 years, well into their 60s, even their late 60s. So this is a very long-lived species. And they live and they forage in flocks. That's their natural inclination. They want to kind of be in a group. We're all kind of going together. Oh, now we're all kind of going. We're going to go feed over here. We're going to go fly over there. That's their normal way to do things. Mostly they eat seeds, but they will eat fruit and leaves. But they're mostly a seed hunter, and it takes a lot of seeds. They have a very large, powerful beak that is used for cracking open those nuts and seeds. Now, they live in tropical deciduous forests, and the elevation is about 1,900 feet above sea level to about 4,900 feet above sea level. So there's a good range there, but it's quite low compared to, sort of what I'm used to, or compared to the thick-billed parrot, which we talked about, which lives much higher. So again, it's kind of tropical lowlands to medium highlands, but these deciduous forests. Now, pair bonding is incredibly strong in this species. A mated pair will mate for life, and they'll stay together year-round as well, and they're incredibly well pair bonded. Now, in captivity, of course, they will bond with you and become very well bonded, and it can be very traumatic to change a housing situation, where if they go to live with somebody else, it can be really, really difficult and have a big emotional impact on them. They nest in hollow trees, and that's an important thing. In their habitat, they are more able to find hollow trees than the thick-billed parrots we talked about are. So they are more able to find nesting sites. They have a more powerful beak than thick-billed parrots. So if they find a kind of a mediocre nest site, they can use that powerful beak to chew and tear out chunks until they have a nice opening. But I mean, there's some massive hollow trees in their range. They are a very social species year-round, as I mentioned earlier, and they talk incredibly well. This is another species that learns how to talk easily without any training, and they have a sense of humor. They learn to joke around with you, and they absolutely do learn what they mean with their words. So military macaws, incredible species, and I've loved working with them before. They're fascinating, and I can see why ancient people held them in such high regard. The Scarlet Macaw. This is my favorite of all macaws, and arguably the most iconic parrot species on Earth. If you just say parrot, most people will picture a Scarlet Macaw. These are incredible birds. I've trained many of them. They're beautiful. They're strikingly beautiful, and they're wonderful to work with, and they're gorgeous in the wild as well. Now, Scarlet Macaws today, they live in Mexico, Central America, and in the Amazon basin. Now, the elevation range is usually around 1,600 feet above sea level to about 3,300 feet above sea level. So kind of a range there, and their range is kind of patchy. And depending on the ebb and flow of food sources in the wild, they'll expand range and retract. But again, it's spotty throughout their range. Currently, that's where they live, but historically, they used to range as far north as southern Texas. If you can imagine seeing these birds flying around Texas, how crazy that would have been. And obviously, this is a species that was greatly valued in the trade back and forth anciently. And I'll go way more in depth into this in my video about the ancient Macaw trade. But the Scarlet Macaw was the prize among all prizes. So military macaws and thick-billed parrots that I already mentioned, those species were a lot closer to Puebloan peoples. Geographically, they were a lot closer, a lot easier to get. But the one species that everybody really wanted was a Scarlet Macaw. Part of it was the color and the religious significance, and it was the most exotic thing that could be had in the ancient world. The most decadent thing, perhaps the most spiritually important thing that could be had. And so even though it used to range as far as southern Texas, this was still an incredible bird to be able to get if you were an ancient Puebloan people of any kind. Now, their conservation status, fortunately right now, they are listed as a species of least concern. So the numbers are doing pretty darn good, which is great to hear. Their diet in the wild is a bit more tropical than the other parrots we mentioned earlier. Their diet, they have a lot of fruit, they have a lot of nuts, they eat seeds, they eat flowers, they'll eat nectar, and occasionally they'll eat insects and larvae and even snails, oddly, if they need that extra bit of protein. Think about that diet, because when we're getting into other videos talking about the Macaw Trade, there's not fruit and not so readily available in the southwestern United States for ancient people to feed the macaws that they had shipped up on foot. So something to consider. Again, that diet, fruit, nuts, seeds, flowers, nectar, and occasionally insects and larvae and things like that. Not exactly the southwestern available diet there. The interesting thing about this species is they will eat large poisonous seeds. They'll eat fruit that has poisonous seeds and big giant seeds that are of themselves poisonous. They have nutrition, but they have toxins that will kill. They definitely kill a person, and they will kill a parrot as well. The macaws understand this, and they handle it. So they'll eat it, and then they'll go to these forests, they'll eat these poisonous seeds, and then they'll fly to another part of the rainforest where there is clay. And they will eat clay, and these clay deposits that they consume will neutralize the poison in them. And there's actually been a lot of studies that have been done about that, and some people kind of in the pseudoscience industry have gotten on that bandwagon and have said, oh yeah, see, let's take some of this same clay, and you take little clay capsules and it'll help neutralize toxins in your body. Hey, maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't with humans, I don't know. But we know for a fact that it allows these scarlet macaws to eat seeds that would otherwise be completely poisonous to them. So they're beating the system that way. The estimates are that there are between 50,000 and 500,000 individuals in the wild. So that's pretty good. They're doing all right. They still need our protection, but that's nice to know, because such a glorious bird, you know, the other two that we mentioned earlier are not doing nearly as well. The earliest known example of aviculture that we have in the New World is in the 11th century at Paquime in Mexico, in Chihuahua, just south of the Texas border, barely there. You have the breeding of macaws. There were breeding chambers, and we know that they were bred and dispersed from this site throughout the Four Corners region. Earlier than this, we see that feathers and wings were shipped forth and live birds were shipped forth, but we believe that these nests were raided and babies at a very specific age, which I'll get to in the long form video, were hauled northward and traded. But in the 11th century, Paquime started breeding macaws and learned how to do it. So again, it's the first example we have in the New World of aviculture and the breeding of parrots and then of shipping them northward. Now, scarlet macaws can talk extremely well. They're very adept at being able to talk and learn many languages. They absolutely learn what they are saying. And you got to think about, again, to ancient people, how magical would that have been? You have an animal that is speaking your language and even knows what it is saying. That's very incredible. They breed very well in captivity, not as well as a blue and gold macaw. Blue and gold macaws and military macaws breed with more ease than scarlet macaws, but scarlet macaws are a close third, so they do very well in captivity. These are incredible birds. I have raised many of them. I also have friends who raise them currently and fly them. It's kind of a neat new thing that happens. Marshall Radio Telemetry in Utah manufactures radio telemetry originally for falcons, but now they have also made versions that work well for macaws. And there are people who free fly their macaws. They'll take them out to canyons and they'll put a bunch of them together and train them to all circle around and fly together and come back. It's really quite remarkable to watch. So scarlet macaws, beautiful species, and again, this is kind of the king of the birds in the hierarchy. Even today, tribes today in the Southwest, still the scarlet macaw is held in extreme high regard. And in the modern Native American church, which is official church, the Native American church, has a great reverence for macaw feathers, and they will take the deck feathers, which are the two middle feathers on the tail of a scarlet macaw, the longest feathers, and they'll make a ceremonial fan made of all of those feathers, and that is part of a sacred ceremonial item that is still used even to this day. So scarlet macaws have a rich history in the New World. Even though they're coming up from Mexico, they made it as far north as Utah, which is pretty incredible. Well, I hope you enjoyed this kind of a condensed version, learning about some of these different birds. And again, these are the three birds that we know for sure were traded up from the south. And again, it's the thick-billed parrot, the military macaw, and the scarlet macaw. The fact that there was an Amazon parrot that was found in the Mimbres region, remains of it, and the fact that there was a white-fronted parrot that was found at grasshopper ruins in Arizona shows that there very well could have been a lot of other trade going on of other birds. But most of those remains are just lost to time. We'll never know, but we can assume that there was other exotic bird species here and there making their way up in addition to the macaw trade and the thick-billed parrot trade. We can assume that, we can infer that and guess that that is probably accurate, is likely the case. Next thing we're going to talk about is what archaeological sites have parrots been found at. Now, it's important to remember that far more macaw remains have been found than most people are aware of. You'll hear, oh, there's one was found here, or mostly you hear about Chaco Canyon. People are not aware of the vast research that has been done and how many have been found. We're going to go into that. It's also very important that we understand that feathers disintegrate rapidly. Feathers are made out of keratin. It's the same material as our fingernails. It's the same material as our hair. These things do not last well, especially in the desert. They'll dry out, but then they just disintegrate. And there's a lot of types of species of mites that specifically target and eat feathers. So it's entirely possible that many, countless items have been lost to time. Feathers themselves and feather adorned items. So if you have a ceremonial fan with feathers, maybe all that's left at an archaeological site is just what those feathers were attached to, and we have that information lost to time. So it's important to remember that. Also, many amateur pot hunters and early archaeologists have likely discarded parrot bones. Parrot bones are very small, and bones are easily discarded. When people were viewing archaeological sites as more of treasure hunting, and they're looking for something that was of value on the trade market in the early 1900s, I think there's a lot of macaws that may have been tossed by the wayside, unfortunately. So it's important to remember that when we're addressing this. Now, many sites, including the full Chacoan great houses, are unexcavated. For example, at Peñasco Blanco at Chaco Canyon, huge great house, totally unexcavated. Yucca House, which is a huge great house community near Mesa Verde, but down at the low level by Ute Mountain, huge site, completely unexcavated. These sites could have information that would rewrite our understanding of the macaw trade. They could completely rewrite everything. So I have done the best I can to find all the documented recovered macaw remains from archaeological sites. There may be more that I was unable to find in the published literature, but I've done the best I can to get everything. And what I have, it will paint at least a pretty accurate picture of what things were like. The first site that we're going to reference, the archaeological site, is Paquime, which is barely into Mexico. You guys must remember we're talking about the southwest United States and the northwest Mexico. That was one region. Those geographic and political borders did not exist in ancient times. So the Mogollon culture spread, both in the southwest United States and the northwest Mexico. And Paquime was the biggest explosion of Mogollon culture ever. It was enormous, and this place had hundreds and hundreds of rooms that went all over the place. They had trade where they were bringing up cacao beans, live macaws, and they were even breeding macaws at this incredible site. But Paquime has an incredible number. It has at least 500 macaws have been found there. Now, of course, over time, you've got macaws that are coming in anciently and then being shipped further north. So you have that going on. But what was remained when the site was excavated are at least 500 macaws, and at least 18 of those were military macaws. The rest seem to be scarlets. So I will get into the aviculture and breeding that took place at Paquime later on in this video. But again, so when we're covering Mexico, we know Paquime, 500 macaws. So after Paquime, the next area we want to talk about is Arizona. Arizona has had a lot of archaeology done, and let's take a look at the sites here. If we look at a list of all the archaeological sites that have yielded macaws, it's quite extensive. Now, the total for the region is 120 macaws have been uncovered, and 125 parrots total. You've got a few extras in there. You have some thick-billed parrots and some white-fronted parrots and a few other oddities in there. But 120 macaws total. It's pretty impressive. Most of these Arizona sites only have like a whole entire pueblo community. One macaw, maybe two macaws are recovered. There's some notable differences. At the Eldon Pueblo, there were 2 macaws found, and they were buried with copper bells. We'll get into copper bells and how that's meaningful later on. We know at Turkey Creek, there were 17 macaws found, so quite a big bump there. And at Grasshopper Ruin, we have a lot more. We have 20 macaws that were uncovered there, and 1 white-fronted parrot, which is kind of an oddity. Also at Grasshopper Ruin, we find that there were skins. So almost like early proto-taxidermy, where once a macaw died, now it might have died naturally, it might have been sacrificed, but the skin was kind of stuffed in a primitive but preservative manner. So we assume this was used in a ritual manner. It kind of makes sense. We also have the remains of a scarlet macaw that was buried in a reverential manner with on top of a 6-year-old child. So apparently, a 6-year-old child had passed away, and when they were interred, that a macaw in a ritual manner was buried on top of them. Now, we don't know if that was sacrificed at that time or if the macaw had died beforehand. We don't know, but we understand that there was great reverence in this area. So again, a lot going on in the Arizona region. Most notable is at Upatki. Now, Upatki is a site in Arizona that is a Chacoan great house. It has Chacoan style architecture, and it was connected to Chaco Canyon. But it wasn't that huge. It only had like 100 rooms, but yet outside of Chaco Canyon, Upatki has the highest number of macaws anywhere. Upatki had 49 macaws that were uncovered there. At least 22 of them were scarlets, and there were also 5 thick-billed parrots. So whatever was going on at Upatki, there was some real power there, both in terms of being able to get macaws from Mexico up to Upatki, but also the sheer numbers they had there. So keep your eyes on Upatki, because we need to get more research done there. But again, odd to have such a comparatively small pueblo have so many macaws, as most of the others in the Arizona region only have 1, maybe 2 macaws, and even that was something spectacular. So Upatki definitely was yielding some strong Chacoan power. The next region is the Mimbres region. Now, the Mimbres culture is kind of loose. Mimbres is part of the greater Mogollon tradition, but how do I put this? All Mimbres is Mogollon, but not all Mogollon is Mimbres, to try to kind of explain that. So the Mimbres culture goes throughout much of the Southwest and even into northwestern Mexico. And as I mentioned earlier, Paquime in Mexico is part of the Mogollon culture. But Mimbres is very noteworthy because it has quite distinct pottery. Now, an odd thing about the Mimbres culture is that it wasn't stratified in a way that had a lot of central power. It was a tradition, it was a way of life that was spread out over a region, but it didn't have, again, a lot of centralized power controlling things. So this is in southwestern New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico. The Mimbres culture the pottery is what it is known for. It's so famous that a lot of people will do prints of Mimbres pottery and put it on like bags and cards and different things, just because it's so unique and so advanced in its figurative depiction. It tells a story. So Mimbres is known, and I've done a video on that. If you go, we've got a video on Mimbres pottery specifically. I'll put a link to that as well in the rest of the description of this video. But in the Mimbres region, we have a total of 22 macaws uncovered, 6 thick-billed parrots, and 1 Amazon parrot. So the interesting thing is that even though this was a loose area with not a lot of centralized power, they were still getting live macaws in this region. Now, stay tuned, because much later on in this video, I'm going to be addressing where the macaws came from. And the Mimbres macaws, spoiler, are from a different area than the Chacoan macaws came from, but that will be coming up. Now, the next area is, of course, New Mexico. That's the biggie. New Mexico, oddly, does not have a lot of data. So it's all, you can get information on Chaco and Chaco outliers, but it's hard to find information on macaws anywhere outside of Chaco and the Chaco outliers. So, but Chaco has a lot. So we know at Arroyo Hondo, there were 3 macaws, and that's near the modern day Taos Pueblo. We know the Solomon Ruins Great House, which I've been told by the people who work at the Solomon Ruins, it's not Salmon, it's Solomon, named after Mr. Solomon. So the Solomon Great House is a proper Chacoan great house, not a big one, but it's still a proper Chacoan community. And there we find 9 macaws. And interestingly, one of those 9 macaws on the ulna, this bone right here, they found ulnas of several macaws, but one of them, the bone, has been covered and stained and dyed with red ochre pigment post-mortem. So in other words, a macaw that had either died naturally or had been sacrificed after the fact, a bone, had been kept and colored red. Might be a fact to associate with the fact that this is the bone from a Scarlet Macaw, so we're going to have this sacred bone be remembered with red coloration, which the bird was in life. You can think of in terms of a lot of different reasons why that may have been. Red was a sacred color, of course, but if you are trying to draw attention to the fact, whether in ceremonial or for in public reasons, the fact that this bone is not just any bird bone, this isn't a turkey ulna. No, this is a ulna from a Scarlet Macaw, and we're going to draw attention to the fact by dyeing it red. That's a possibility. But for whatever reason, we know that this bone, post-mortem, was stained with red ochre pigment. So that is notable. Aztec, New Mexico. If you're unfamiliar with the region, Aztec has nothing to do with the Aztecs. Aztec, New Mexico, the Aztec ruins at New Mexico are an enormous, highly condensed Chacoan great house community with all the wealth that you can imagine a Chacoan great house would have. I cannot find any information on whether or not macaws have been found there. If you know of that, please let me know in the comments down below. But trying to dig through archaeological papers and the research literature, I can't find any information on that, which is odd. It's surprising to me how little information to the general public is available about Aztec. Aztec is an incredible site, and outside of Chaco, I consider it to be kind of the biggest Chacoan great house. It's very impressive. And it even has a restored great kiva. It's the only restored great kiva that I'm aware of. And when you go inside, it's quite a moving experience. So it gives you a sense of how powerful this particular community was. But did they have macaws? One would assume so, but I cannot find information suggesting that. And the last is, of course, Chaco Canyon itself. Chaco Canyon, New Mexico has many, many great houses. We know that there was at least 51 macaws that were recovered there. And again, there is a number of great houses with hundreds of rooms that are entirely unexcavated that likely also would boost those numbers to be much higher. But there's at least 51 macaws, and these are consolidated in Pueblo Bonito, which is the most famous and most restored great house that you can tour. Pueblo de Arroyo, which is right across the way there from Pueblo Bonito. And there's other completely unexcavated great houses, like I said, so who knows where else they could have also have been. This area has also been subject to a lot of really good archaeology, but also a lot of early pot hunting and looters. And again, feathers don't last, and bone remains will probably be chucked by the wayside and not viewed as very much. But an important thing to notice, and with all of these sites that I've mentioned so far, is that in Chaco, there is a consolidation of where the Macaws are. Chaco Canyon is huge. It has lots of pueblos and lots of great houses, but it seems as though the Macaw ownership was condensed just to two great houses and nowhere else. Where other areas such as Mimbres, that I mentioned earlier, the Mimbres Valley, those pueblos, it's like, every community seems to have a macaw. And same thing with those Arizona sites. It seems every big pueblo seemed to have a live macaw, at least one. So there is a difference in how these animals are being kept. And again, I will get into that more in depth later on. Now, next is Utah. We do not yet have any excavated sites in Utah that confirm that Utah sites had live macaws. I think it's very possible, but we do know that the influence and the reverential view of macaws as having great spiritual credit, great spiritual value, most definitely did extend up into Utah. We see a lot of images, a lot of petroglyphs and pictographs depicting macaw feather headdresses, and most famous is at the edge of the Cedars Museum. There is a beautiful kind of like a sash, some sort of adornment where there are macaw feathers. There's scarlet macaw feathers and blue and gold macaw feathers. Now, the interesting thing, this is a highlight. Everybody goes to see this at this museum. Every time I go, I've got to go see it again in person and just experience it. It's so remarkable. It's so beautiful. There's some sort of cordage, and individual small, very small macaw feathers are wrapped in and tied in and woven into this, so you get this bright color. Now, this was made locally because the top part is made out of a tree squirrel of a species that we have locally. So it would seem as though cords of color were a trade item. So if you just have some cordage and you just wrap in little, macaw feathers into that, that would be a splash of color, again, associating with the sacred scarlet macaw. It would have huge value. It would be an amazing trade item, which is basically junk. Those tiny feathers, I've had macaws, and when my macaws molt, I'm always saving the primary feathers and the tail feathers, these wing feathers. But those little feathers, they molt. It's like I just chuck them. But if you gather those up and you weave them in like this, then you have this beautiful thing that you can use as a trade item that would be worth a lot of value back in those days. But again, Utah, no confirmed sites have live macaws, but it's definitely possible. But for sure, macaw feathers are trading. The fact that this item was found, again, if it just happened to have been slightly wetter at the site it was found, those feathers would have disintegrated, but you would have had the cordage underneath, and it would have just been viewed as some sash. So how many items in Utah had feathers, but the feathers are disintegrated? We'll never know, but we can assume much. So those are the main areas that we talk about, the main regions, the sites that have been excavated. And again, there's countless sites that are not fully excavated that could have also had things, and there's likely countless feathers and feather artifacts that have disintegrated that would have shed more light on what regions had macaws. The Macaw Trade. We're going to get into this. Now, the Macaw Trade itself requires some backstory to understand how it came to be, what it was, and why it was so important. So I hope you're with me on this. And again, if you really want to understand how all this all worked, this is important back history to understand how the Macaw Trade really came to be and why it likely came to be. So, post-World War I, there was a huge effort in the United States to cultivate what is known as Pueblo mystique. The idea was let's view these ancient ruins as very localized, very small. We want to view these as Zen prayer farmers. The soldiers coming back from World War I were shell-shocked. They were so rattled. It was the first truly industrialized war, and New Mexico in particular made huge conscious efforts to cultivate the idea of, hey, you've been shell-shocked, you've been to war, come to these beautiful deserts, come see these ruins, and come get immersed in the peace it brings. And it is very beautiful. You go to any of these ancient sites, they're gorgeous, they're beautiful, and they are very peaceful. That doesn't mean they were in life, but that was cultivated. We even have minutes of the town elders of some of these towns that Dr. Lex in some of his books have documented these very well, where some of these town elders say, what are we going to do to get people to come out here and have tourism in these areas? And at first they kind of tried some of the pioneer heritage, and that didn't do anything. And they said, well, what about the Spanish mission? And well, by then you had the railroad, and you could get a Spanish mission in California that was still up and running and beautiful, and the ones in New Mexico were kind of falling apart. That didn't work, so they glommed onto this idea of Pueblo mystique. And this has permeated the view of the Southwest to our day, which is not accurate whatsoever. These weren't just little Zen prayer farmers, just, keeping it local. In truth, there were vast trade routes with Mexico. There was line of sight communication. We have sites, for example, at Chimney Rock, Colorado, Aztec, New Mexico. There's sites where we find in Mesa Verde where there were burning pits where line of sight from, 40, 50, 60 miles away, you would burn this giant cauldron area to alert, it was just kind of yes or no answers. Maybe, a certain time of year, hey, you got to come over here for whatever, pay tribute. We don't know. But it's kind of like if you've seen Lord of the Rings, there's that scene with light the beacons of Gondor, and on top of these mountains there are these preset fires with oil, and you light them, and then the next one down lights it and lights it. They literally had that kind of system set up and used it. So the trade was vast. Now, we also know there's the famous Puebloan runners. We also have this in Mexico, where we know that individuals would run, and you would just run and take your message to the next group and take it to the next group, and they take it to the next group. And we have these contests still today. We have documented in the early 1900s where it was, okay, you're going to do a run. It was like a death run. It's like you're going to go run this distance, and whoever gets it, then your reward at the end is you get a thing of water. And it's kind of like, hey, look how good I am at this. We know it's still in Mexico today. This is huge in northwestern Mexico. There's still these contests where it's like we're going to run some of these big old marathons across the desert. We know these famous runners would deliver messages surprisingly quickly. When I drive in the Southwest, I just am in awe. I think of myself always on foot as I'm going, 70 miles an hour down the freeway. I'm thinking, how crazy would it be to cross this on foot? But again, people did, both walking and also running and delivering messages at surprisingly fast rates. Now, we know that there were, in addition to these runners, that a lot of these sites, there were pilgrimage feasts, there were ceremonies, there were dances, that people came together in large communities. So there were certain sites that were sacred, and at certain times of year, different people would come together and would honor and do various things. Okay, so these are not just tiny little pueblos. Now, from Mexico, amazing and terrible things came up. Brilliant ideas and a lot of very violent things also, which I will get into later. But trade goods, ideas, violence, slave trades, live macaws, ritual cannibalism, cacao beans, all kinds of crazy stuff came up. Amazing trade items came up. Shell beads from the Pacific. The Chumash people would trade and trade over, and so we have these amazing shells and shell work from the Pacific Ocean. Corn. Now, corn was domesticated from a plant called teosinte. Thousands of years ago, people in central Mexico domesticated teosinte into corn. But the people in Mexico were always cultivating new breeds of corn, new colors, new sizes. Some are sweet, some are better for drying out. These new strains would be traded northward from Mexico to the people of the Puebloan Southwest. Turkeys are also domesticated, by people in Mexico. And new turkey breeds were traded up. You trade them as babies. You just have little baby turkeys, and I'll get into what it took to haul macaws. But again, live turkeys, young live turkeys, were being traded northward out of Mexico. Now, cacao is one of the most important things, and I'll do a separate video just on the cacao trade. It used to be believed that cacao beans were coming all the way up from Central America, which could be, but it turns out there's this part in Mexico in the Puerto Vallarta region that cacao beans can be cultivated. It's tropical enough, they're cultivated there even to this day. And checking the DNA in the theobromine plant, we can see this is the region that they did come from. Now, cacao is made into drinks like ish cacao and chocolate, ceremonial drinks that had vital, important religious significance. Now, we see the Mayan people, for example, had ritual cacao mugs that were usually red, and there was a very special way that they would pour and back and forth between these mugs and get this kind of a froth to it. And we see in Chaco Canyon that there were also ritual cacao mugs. They were different. They were long and narrow, and they had little rings around the edges that likely had rope and maybe had other adornments. So these are ritual mugs. And we test and see inside, and there's still residue from theobromine, so we can tell that cacao was in these mugs. So cacao was a huge trade item. Interestingly, we've had recent studies that have shown cacao made it as far as Utah, even before Chaco, the Chacoan explosion. So it was an item for a long time. But of course, the most important thing that was traded, the most wild thing, was macaws, because macaws are alive. Macaws are amazing. They can talk, and they absolutely can learn what they're saying. And these were coming up from 700 miles away. And when I get into the husbandry and the care, you're going to see just how insane it is that these live macaws on foot from 700 miles away were transported up north. It's very incredible. What mechanism, though, got knowledge of reverence of macaws into the Southwest? Like, you've got an animal that's 700 miles away from you. How are you even aware it exists? And then, even if you're aware it exists, why would you develop such cultivated reverence for a species like that? It's kind of strange when you think about it. It's like, well, why would you have that? It's like me, with elephants. We don't have elephants in Utah. Elephants are really cool, but if you're aware of them and they're like, oh, they become sacred to our people. Well, they're not even from your area. So how do you even become aware of them, let alone how do they become sacred and integral to your local society? So we're going to talk about what mechanisms likely got macaws, both their reverence and the live macaws themselves, up into what is now the United States. To understand how this came to be, we got to go back in time a little bit to understand how you connect Mexico with southwestern United States. So going back in time, around 300 AD, Teotihuacan dominated central Mexico. Teotihuacan is very famous. Most people know the Temple of the Sun and the Temple of the Moon. It's an incredible site in central Mexico. And it flourished, it dominated, and again, 300 AD, it was top notch. But by 650 AD, by that time, things had gone to pot. It was looted and violently destroyed by that time. So in the aftermath of the fall of Teotihuacan, because there's hundreds of thousands of people, and so you have different cultures coming in, intermixing, moving, going, you have different things going on. So the Toltecs emerge from the collapse of Teotihuacan. The Toltecs emerged all-powerful, but by 1000 AD, their tribute-demanding and militaristic theocracy collapsed in turn. So Toltecs also collapsed. So between 800 AD and 1000 AD, waves of people surged into the Southwest. Wide ranges of people. You had cultists, priests, warriors, pilgrims, traders, miners, farmers, stoneworkers, professional flint knappers. All of these people were fleeing or were displaced by widespread unrest and civil war. So people were moving, people were going, people were assimilating into new groups. There was a lot of upheaval. People moving north brought new religious ideas, and they brought new religious icons that had not formerly been seen in the southwestern United States by the Puebloan people. With these waves of new people coming in with new ideas, they're coming into areas where people already exist. So now we've got to go into the Chacoan explosion. Chaco Canyon is this incredible site in New Mexico, this amazing, I like to call it the Chaco Empire. People might say that I'm misusing that term a little bit. Chaco was truly great, and truly terrible things happened at Chaco Canyon. But there were already people there to begin with. So it seems that the Chaco region was already inhabited by Puebloan people who were living in pretty normal Puebloan style lives. So you have, kind of mesa top pueblos, not cliff dwellings, but just, hey, we're just making these adobe pueblos. We're living here. We're cultivating corn that had been traded up from Mexico. We're doing some hunting, we're doing some gathering, pretty normal Puebloan style life. But with these waves of new people coming into Chaco, new ideas started to emerge. And it reshaped the social structure completely. It developed kind of a new culture, a new style, and an empire with vast trade with Mexico. Now, sometimes we do in archaeology something wrong, which is called upstreaming, which is we look back in time and we assume, well, this became this, became this, became this. And we just go through the line that way. It's just a natural assumption. But what we don't realize is that in fact, people and cultures branch out in all different ways, sometimes in fantastic ways that then don't go anywhere. So that's important to remember. Chaco didn't necessarily have to become something else. And the people who were already there didn't necessarily have to become Chacoan. But we see this stratified culture out of Chaco with haves and have-nots. But we got to get back to the Macaws. But it's just important to remember that one would think that all the Macaws shipped north from Mexico were from the same source. This is 700 miles away. One would assume the Macaws making this journey that people have a monopoly on this market, and that's the case. DNA has shown that to be otherwise. DNA has shown that two distinct Macaw populations from two distinct, very separate regions fueled this trade. One population went to the Chaco and Chaco outliers. One population went to the Mimbres region. So mentioned Mimbres earlier. These two different regions that are close by, the Macaws came from two very different regions to these sites. But Chaco was a magnet, Chaco had power and influence, and Chaco was able to get live Macaws shipped to them. There are some people who say the otherwise, that people went down to Mexico to get Macaws. I'll explain why I think that that is not accurate later. Well, now we need to talk about why were Macaws sacred? Why were they viewed as sacred? Why were they considered sacred? Again, Macaws are not from the southwestern United States. They're not even from southwestern Mexico. So why on earth were they so sacred? Well, it's interesting because in Mexico and Mesoamerica, where these Macaws came from, these people were far more focused on blue and turquoise in color. Most of their mythology, there's a lot with rain spirits, wind spirits, weather spirits, and there's a lot of blue associated in that, both in the art and in the depictions. The quetzal is a bird. It's in the trogon family, and quetzals are kind of viewed as a flying serpent. When you see them take off in the sky, they have this tail that just goes behind them like a snake's tail, these beautiful, brilliant feathers, and they have a little bit of red on the chest. So you hear legends of the fiery flying serpent. Well, that's the bird that kind of represents that idea. It's a bird that it's a serpent because it's green like a snake, and the tail moves in that, but it's got that little bit of red flame on the chest. A very, very iconic bird. And you see a lot of depictions of Mesoamerican royalty where they'll have a headdress made out of quetzal feathers, these blue quetzal feathers. So overall, it seems in Mesoamerica that was far more important, the emphasis on the blues. Mesoamerican religions seem to emphasize blue and turquoise. However, Mesoamerican political authorities seem to emphasize red. So this is kind of interesting. The pyramids we see today have lost their red color. They were originally painted red and scarlet. So it's kind of interesting to understand how this works, because when you go and you see, like if you go to like Tikal today, if you go see the ruins of Tikal, they're just gray, they're just stone. And that's what you assume it is. But we have seen and tested, and there were pigments. These things were covered red. So there's an interesting thing. In Mesoamerica, we see that blue has an association with religious and spiritual authority. Red has an association with political authority. So keep those in your mind. Politics and religion were intertwined, but we see that the more people and religion had power, the bigger the ball courts. For example, at Chichen Itza. So here's what I'm saying. The Mayan ball game, the Mesoamerican ball game, was more than just a sporting event. It had deep religious connotation, and the Mayan scripture, the Popol Vuh, it's about these hero twins, and part of what it boils down to, they are battling the lords of death in a drawn-out ball game that takes place over several days. And so the ball game is about the people having power, and power over even things like the lords of death. So what we see on cultures where the religion and the government were more separated and the people had more power, the ball courts are enormous. So if you look at Chichen Itza, it has the famous step pyramid, El Castillo. It's probably one of the most iconic Mayan step pyramids. This thing is huge, but you know what? It's dwarfed by the ball court. The ball court is literally like quadruple the size of the footprint of this temple. Now these ball courts are shaped like a capital I, so you don't just look at the walls, you look at the eye part around it. That's also part of it. So these eye-shaped ball courts, huge, because Chichen Itza had a good separation of church and state, and the people had a lot of power and a lot of influence, so they had an enormous ball court. You compare that to Tikal, another very famous site, and at Tikal, when you look there, you have this super steep, enormous pyramid, and the only ball court on the site is right next to it, and it's tiny. It's pathetically small, and it is very much a political statement. It is saying, hey, church and state are intertwined, we're the same thing, and the people are under the thumb of church and state. And so by having the ball court, symbol of the people, so tiny and right next to this enormous pyramid, it's very much a strong political statement. So those are the two extremes. Kind of in between, you have Paquime in Mexico. Now, Paquime was a city of the people. It had huge agave roasting pits where you'd have these huge festivals. People come together, you throw agave plants in there, you roast them, and it makes them, caramelizes them so they get very sweet, and you eat them. And Paquime has the largest proper, farthest north proper ball court, proper eye-shaped ball court. So again, when you're thinking of colors, when you're thinking of macaws, you have to always understand, what does the color represent? And again, the blue represents more of spiritual, where red has a lot to do with political authority. And factor that in when we're continue talking here. Transporting macaws is vital to understanding this whole thing. And this is some very vital information. If you're an archaeologist and you're trying to compose an understanding in your head on how this works, you've got to understand some of this information. And so hopefully this is some of the most useful information to people, because I have raised macaws, I have bred macaws, I have trained them to fly and talk, used them in educational programs for years. So I'm bringing some insight and information that most people do not have. I've even raised them from babies and hand-fed them, and I think this is very vital to understanding this trade. So, talking about how they're transporting. Understanding the trade of macaws requires you having the following considerations. First of all, live macaws were shipped from at least 700 miles away. They were shipped on foot. There were no wagons, there were no horses, there were no beasts of burden. traveling on foot for trade requires hauling your own food, your own water, your own supplies, if you're bringing any bedding of any kind, as well as food for the birds and whatever trade goods you're hoping to trade. So that is a consideration, because I think about that, just what it takes for me to travel with a macaw in a vehicle, how much I have to bring. And if I was going 700 miles on foot, hauling a macaw, not easy. Adult macaws cannot be hauled in a basket or a wooden crate. They would chew their way out. And when I get into the husbandry more, I will talk about the bite force and the power of macaws. Macaws tear things apart constantly, and that's part of what's built into them, and I'll get into why later. But again, you're not hauling an adult macaw. If you have a cage or a basket, which some people have postulated, oh yeah, they were hauled in baskets. You're not taking an adult macaw in a basket. It will chew its way out in a matter of a few minutes, and it absolutely would. I don't care if it's trained, it's still going to do it. It says, something chewable, I'm going to shred this to pieces, and it's going to come out. You need to factor that in. Archaeological evidence shows that young birds were shipped, not adults. The fallacy of the medicine journey to Mesoamerica for macaws, I've got to address this one. There are people who, and I like this idea, this is a beautiful idea. Because these birds were so revered, the idea is that maybe a medicine man would take a journey down to Mexico to get a macaw, and they would go and learn from somebody who had them, and they would learn how to care for them and get their own and kind of do an apprenticeship, learning how to work with a macaw. And then they would on foot go all the way back 700 miles up, and they would be heralded as this great medicine journey they had taken to the southern lands, and coming back with this amazing talking bird. How incredible. That's a beautiful idea, but in no way, shape, or form is it practical in any way. Also, just because an animal is revered does not mean that it's well cared for, especially in ancient times. We know from the barbules on the macaws that have been recovered that they were ripping off the primary wing feathers. They were just ripping them out. So there are so many people who have these ideas of macaws flying through these pueblos, and people, it drives me nuts, but people understandably suggest that the T-shaped doors are to allow for macaws to fly through. It's like, well, you could just have the bottom open. You don't have to have it narrowed. We find in the deepest parts, in Pueblo Bonito, the deepest, dingiest parts is where we find the macaw remains. We don't find them being out and about. They could have been, but I'll get into that later as well. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. But the important thing to remember is, just because you know what you're doing with an animal doesn't necessarily mean you're well cared for. I'm a falconer, and I try to practice a high level of husbandry and care for the birds of prey I train. There are other peoples around. The falconry has only been around for, 100 years in America, if that. But there's other countries where it's been around for thousands of years. Now, the way they train their birds work, but a lot of the way some of these people in other countries treat their birds is not good. They're really rough with them, and there's just husbandry techniques that would not pass they're not cared for in a very good way. And I think that's the case here as well. I think that these birds had a lot of value, and I think they were greatly revered, but it doesn't necessarily translate to care. So again, the idea of somebody going down and that there's these great macaw, I think the Macaw Trade was people trying to make money. I think they didn't have cash, but it was about, hey, this is something of value, we're going to ship it up north in exchange for something that I'll get into in a bit. But you got to understand this. You got to understand that what it took, and again, fast forward if you want to the husbandry section, and you will see why it is totally unfeasible and impractical to have somebody take a medicine journey to Mexico and come back with a live macaw. Totally unfeasible. Beautiful idea, but totally unfeasible. So just had to throw that out there. Now, when you're raising a baby macaw and you're hand feeding them, I have done this. I have been a professional. I worked for a breeder company and would feed them, and it is intense. Raising them professionally, you're feeding them day and night, and you are having kind of a mash that you have to make up that has all the certain nutrients and ingredients, and it's ground up and mixed with water, and you're doing it with a syringe, and they open their mouth and you squirt it down in. You have to fill their crop. You have to not put too much, otherwise it can go septic in their crop and go bad. Sometimes if they're around each other, they might accidentally perforate their crop. There's a lot that goes into it. Hand feeding a bird almost 24/7 with macaws, it is an insane amount of work. Somebody traveling with the macaw, even if there was knowledge of how to do that, they're not going to be doing that. They're not going to have mash and like, okay, every 20 minutes we're going to go ahead and we're going to feed this bird again. You're not doing that for 700 miles. When you're also carrying your own food, your own water, and having to keep these birds warm at night, that's not how it's going to work. It's highly unlikely that babies this young were shipped, that really young babies of the hand feeding age were shipped. Nests were likely rated at a specific age when the babies were weaning off of their parents' feeding. That gives enough time for a baby that is kind of what we call a brancher age, a young bird to be in a basket, because it's an age where it's like, oh, when mom and dad are here, I stand up and I get fed, otherwise I'm sitting down. There's enough time to travel 700 miles on foot to get a nest-rated baby up to the Puebloan world. There's enough time to have them grow in that time where they're not going to be shredding apart your basket. They're not going to be trying to fly. They're not going to be biting you and attacking you. There is a brief window, and that's what would work in that time frame. Transporting in a basket as a makeshift nest would work in that time. Now I'm going to show you some pictures here to show you kind of the age progression. And if you look at these, you can see how they grow. They grow fairly quickly, but in these younger weeks, they're not very strong, and they're not all about tearing things apart yet. If you get an adult macaw, it is going to be violent and aggressive. If you went and like caught a macaw, or even today, if you get a macaw that's a retired breeder that wasn't hand raised, a macaw that is not hand raised is dangerous. It can literally bite your fingers off, and it will want to. It's going to be aggressive. It doesn't want to be held. And I will say, even the way I hold my macaws is I use a T-perch. I just take like, and I use that, and we call it a bite stick in the industry. And so when you get them out of the cage, you don't use your hand. You put that bite stick in and they bite it, and then they stand off and you pull them out and you hold them on this, and then you go take them to another perch. Maybe you can pet them, but you don't hold them on your hand. That's not actually normal for them. It's not good for the way they grip. It's not normal. And in the husbandry section, I'll get more into this. But the important thing to remember is that you're not shipping an adult macaw. You're not carrying an adult macaw on foot or on a perch for 700 miles. You're also not taking a baby. You're taking a young bird that's just getting ready to start to walk around the nest, but not fly yet. That's the age when they're starting to wean off and eating more solid food on their own. Because again, what the parents do is the parents will chew up food, and it's in their crop, and then they'll regurgitate it in the baby's mouth. That's a little bit different. You can't have a bird that you're doing that to while you're traveling 700 miles. So factor that in when you're understanding the transport and how this worked. So again, when we're talking about this hand feeding thing, this hand raising of babies, if you're taking a baby at that certain age when they're just barely weaned from eating regurgitated food from mom and dad, you're reaching the perfect age by the time you're getting to the Southwest. And that's when the primary feathers would be ripped out. So feathers are made out of keratin, like your fingernails, and they grow in. While they are growing in, they have blood flowing through them. And then once a bird hard pins, once the feather's all the way in, the blood retreats back into the body, and the bird's blood pressure goes up, and that's an age where birds of all kinds start to get crotchety and angry. If you pull a blood feather out, the bird will likely bleed to death, especially if it's a big feather like a primary wing feather. So we know that it's probably along the way on this journey, from the time a baby was taken from Mexico And probably halfway between that and when they arrive to their final destination is when, because the feathers as they're growing in, it's like, okay, this feather can be pulled. A day later, this feather can be pulled. A day later, this feather can be pulled. It's not pleasant for the bird, and they will grow the next one next year. But we know, again, from the archaeological sites that these primaries were pulled. And again, this kind of does throw out the myth of these birds just flying around beautifully over these Pueblo sites and over Chaco Canyon, over Pueblo Bonito, where we have T-doors so the macaws can fly through. They weren't. These were highly valuable birds that were not meant for the environment of New Mexico or Arizona, and these were kept close. So that's also important to remember. Macaws may have been brought out, but in Chaco, they were kept in the deepest rooms that it would seem as though they were kind of a status symbol. So maybe you might bring them out because you can't see from the remains, did a person bring out the macaw? Hey, look at me, I'm special, and then go back in. But we know that the macaw remains that were found, there's some burials as well, but the ones that were just found laying around in Chaco, they were in the deepest, most compressed inner parts of these great houses. They weren't out in the open. So they were kept very, very close to the vest, so to speak. Now you compare this to the eagles. The eagles at Chaco Canyon, we know that in Pueblo cultures, eagles are polled as babies, and then they tether them, just the same way turkeys are tethered, and they would have them perch above the Pueblo for all to see, kind of blessing the whole Pueblo community. And then at a certain age, right around the age that they hard pan, they were sacrificed. There are tribes that still do this today in the United States and are legally allowed to do so. Again, if you want to see my video, I have a link in the description to the video I did on eagles in these pueblos and how that all worked. But again, this is very different. It's like, look, I got an eagle tied up here on top. You can't tie down a macaw. You can't make a jest system. They will shred it. There is nothing you can make on the leg of a macaw, save metal, that they're not, and even metal, they can tear apart a lot of metal. Parrots are such jerks. They love to pop things out. Like they will, if you ever go up to pet them and you're a woman with a diamond ring, they just pop that diamond out and taste it and then spit it out. They can just pop a diamond out of a facet super easily. So because they're meant to pull seeds out of these shells of these big giant seed pods. So that's important to remember. All of these things just kind of show that how these birds were kept is maybe not the most romanticized view. But the other question is, what did the Southwest have to trade for? And this is kind of dark, because what did the Southwestern peoples have that Mexico didn't already have? Mexico is bringing forth cacao beans, live turkeys, live macaws, beautiful shell beads, and all these trade items, new strains of corn up from Mexico. What does the Southwest have to offer? Everything the Southwest had, Mexico kind of already had. Well, the archaeology and the oral traditions of the current tribes point to slavery. And there's the people that we call the anasazi. Now, anasazi is thrown around and used loosely. I think in the 1900s, the term anasazi just kind of encompassed anybody from kind of a Pueblo culture. If you have adobe structure, it's anasazi. It's a cool sounding word, but it basically means like ancient enemies. And it turns out that there was kind of separate people. There were Puebloan people, and then there were people who came up from Mexico and stratified society and did a lot of really dark things and may have been doing a slave trade. We know there were slave trades all throughout many, many cultures. There were tribes here in Utah where I'm at where this tribe would capture this tribe, and then they would take them down to Mexico and sell them to the people in what is today Mexico. So we know these slave trades were going on, but the suggestion is that out of places like Chaco Canyon, that might have been, hey, you give us some people, and in exchange, hey, you get a macaw. It's pretty dark, but the evidence does seem to suggest that. But the transportation of live macaws, logistically speaking, is one of the most remarkable achievements in America. Again, when you actually understand what it goes to upkeep a macaw and to take care of them, even in today's world, it's so much work then to think about getting them at the right age, transporting them on foot all the way 700 miles and trading them. It actually is as remarkable of achievement as some of these other great structures that were built at Chaco Canyon, because that you're just dealing with logs and adobe and stone, and those things don't bite back and those things don't die. So again, the Macaw Trade is actually very remarkable and deserves a whole lot more attention and credit for what it was able to accomplish. Mimbres versus Chaco. In this little section, I'm going to be talking about the difference of macaws, both in the terms of the trade and the upkeep in the Mimbres region versus the Chaco region and Chaco outliers. So this is important because there is such a very different. So Chaco had a strong centralized power. They were very centralized in their macaws were also kept in a very centralized way. Mimbres was very decentralized. It was part of the Mogollon culture, and it was very loose. It wasn't like this one area is specifically in charge. As far as we can tell, it was very decentralized. And very importantly, their macaws came from different sources. We have genetically tested the macaws that were found in the Mimbres region and the Chaco and Chaco outliers, and we have confirmed conclusively that those macaws came from two different regions and two different genetic lines. So it's important to remember. So looking at these two, both areas, we see that from 6 AD to about 700 AD, as far as the archaeological record, we just find parts. You know, here's a wing of a macaw. And you got to think too, wings are important. If you have a wing of an eagle or a wing of a hawk or a wing of a macaw, you know, you've got the humerus, the ulna, the radius, and then these carpal bones here. And what you're going to have is all these primary feathers and secondary feathers coming off. You cut it here, you dry it out, and you have a fan that is ceremonial, it's beautiful, and it's in use today. People all over the world, not just Native American cultures, people all over the world today still do that. So those are the kind of parts we see. We do find some skulls, but mostly we just find parts, usually wings from 6 AD to about 700 AD. But once you go to 1000 AD to about 1130 AD, suddenly you see the explosion of live macaws in the southwestern United States and northwestern Mexico. So does the presence of macaws in the Mimbres region and Chaco indicate similar beliefs and uses? Well, the evidence seems to suggest otherwise. We do see some differences. So if we're looking at these two communities, so Mimbres usually has large pueblos, maybe of 100 to 200 rooms. The masonry is very rudimentary. It's not the best masonry. There's 13 large classic pueblos. So there's no social hierarchy that we can tell in the Mimbres region. There's no elites in the culture. And fancy pottery, the most beautiful and fancy of pottery, is even buried with regular folk. So a regular, you know, person's burial might have this incredible, beautiful pottery that Mimbres is known for. Chaco, on the other hand, has massive great houses with like up to 800 rooms. Now these great houses have incredible masonry, and they have foundations where they've dig down underground and do masonry underground to help support these. So these are stratified, well-planned, structurally strong, and they have great kivas. We understand that the great kiva belief system is very much part of the Chaco system. And again, the best great kiva, if you want to see what one is like, is go to Aztec, New Mexico, and there's a great kiva you can go in and get a real sense of this great kiva culture. Chaco had a social hierarchy. They had elites that started accruing exotic goods, including Scarlet Macaws, before AD 1000, before the high point. So in other words, even before you had this big influx, you had macaws making it up north. It's important to remember. Same thing with cacao beans. Cacao beans made it way before these powerful trade routes were in place. Live macaws were making it north way before the heyday of Chaco. So it's important to remember. But these were handled differently. So if you're looking at both of these, so in Mimbres, 16 macaws have been found. In Chaco, 51 macaws have been found. How much has looting impacted these numbers? We're not sure. How much has the unexcavated sites impact? Not sure. I am convinced that many of the Chaco Canyon great houses that are unexcavated would show more macaw feathers. But for right now, what we have is that Chaco Canyon very centralized, and the macaws are kept in a very centralized manner. Mimbres, the macaws are spread out. It's like every little community happens to have a macaw. So it's very, very different. In Mimbres, live macaws and macaw parts like wings were widely distributed. And again, even in small pueblos as small as a 10-room pueblo, that's pretty incredible because, you know, a pueblo with 10 rooms is nothing. You go to Chaco Canyon and, you know, one side of the river there's these great houses with 800 rooms, and the other side of the river you have these little 10, 12-room pueblos in a kiva. Well, those size in Mimbres would have a macaw. It would never be that way in Chaco Canyon. Chaco and the Chaco outlier communities, they had live macaws, and they had parts of macaws as well. And they, but again, it's centralized to a select few sites. In main Chaco Canyon, Solomon and Aztec, these are the kind of outliers where we find this. We also find carved wooden macaws. At Chetro Kettle, which is the great house right next door, just to the east of Pueblo Bonito, we find a bunch of carved wooden macaws. We also, in the canyon, do find some petroglyphs, again, that seem to depict macaws. So again, this is a powerful symbol, even not only the live macaws themselves, but even symbolically. Now, in the Mimbres region, there are 4 macaws that are buried with humans. There's 3 of them that are buried below floors. So below the floor of a house, almost like we're going to bless this house, we're going to bury a macaw that died there. There's 4 that are set up in geometric burials. So you have a macaw, and then you have all these beads and shells and turquoise laid around in beautiful patterns around it. Very reverential. Buried with hundreds of shell beads and turquoise beads. And great reverence is shown. Every macaw found in the Mimbres region, there's great reverence shown for it. In Chaco, some of them were buried with elites, but most are found just randomly scattered around, not in burials. Most of the macaw bones and macaw remains in Chaco Canyon. Remember, Chaco is the one who had the most outside of Paquime, Mexico, right? The highest number of macaws, and yet they're just kind of scattered. Now, this has been interpreted as a lack of reverence, but it could also indicate upheaval and disrespect being shown to the elites after the fact. So again, we know that some bad things happened at Chaco, and we know that there was some upheaval, and maybe, according to oral traditions today of tribes, they say that at White House, or the Great House there at Chaco, that like the people may have kind of revolted, and there's stories that they either took this, they say there's a great gambler, and that this great gambler kind of got all the people and enslaved all of them, but eventually this one person was able to beat the great gambler, and he shot him back to Mexico. In some of the stories, some of the modern tribes say they cut off his head and buried him outside of one of the great houses. In another version, they put him in an arrow and shot him back to Mexico and say, we don't want you doing these dark things here in this area anymore. It seems the tribes that believe that, they also say that they went through and just like smashed everything related to these elites. So like, hey, we're going to break all this pottery. And if that was the case, if that's the case, then that would make sense. And also, if macaws were a symbol of status and a symbol of I'm an elite, it makes sense that any macaws, live or remains of them, would have been probably treated disrespectfully. So that verdict is still out. Is the fact that these macaws at Chaco seem to be just randomly helter-skelter around, is that because Chacoans themselves didn't care that much, or is it because people of the after the fact were trying to show their disrespect for the people who had had those macaws? The jury is still out on that one. So again, either way, we do see a very different approach. We see that the Mimbres region and the Chaco region, both of these peoples had a great reverence for macaws. It seems that the Mimbres people didn't have the wealth that Chaco had, but they had enough wealth to still get live macaws, and it seemed that it was more special to them. It was more reverential. In Chaco, they seemed to consolidate things and consolidate the macaws as well. And again, it seems the evidence shows that the Macaws were not treated as well at Chaco as Mimbres. But again, that could also be circumstantial. But either way, the important thing to remember is these two people had Macaws coming in from two entirely different regions and two entirely different bloodlines. So that is kind of the sum up of Mimbres versus Chaco with how the Macaws were kept. Pottery Mound is a very important site when it comes to having a greater understanding of how macaws were viewed in the ancient world. Now, this is a very late Puebloan community. So this site dates from like 1350 AD to about 1500 AD, which is interesting because normally kind of the ancestral Puebloan period is kind of viewed as 300 BC to 1300 AD. But here we're going all the way to 1500 AD. So as with any culture, as time goes on, cultural ideas change and visual icons change and adapt and evolve. A prime example that I always love to give people when sharing this principle is ancient Egypt, where it used to be that mummies originally kind of formed naturally in the desert, and then later on, royals started adopting mummification to have an afterlife, but the commoners didn't. Then the wealthy started to adopt it, and eventually everybody wanted to get mummified, and there was a huge industry around it. So you see that beliefs change, adapt, and evolve. Now, we know that originally there were no macaws to be found in the American Southwest because they're from 700 miles away. However, eventually they started to ship with ideas and people, and they became an integral part of society and the way things are viewed. Now, unfortunately, Puebloan peoples did not do an excessive amount of figurative depiction. We don't have any writing from them, and so whatever is left behind is what we have. So normally, kivas do not tell us a lot artistically or expressively. So kivas are important. They're a very important part of ancient cultures, and different peoples who utilize them had different beliefs around them. Pottery Mound has 17 kivas. Normally a kiva is pretty straightforward. It's below ground, you go down a ladder, and inside there's columns all around the outside. Logs are stacked up around these, and so it's an underworld kind of situation. And normally the adobe clay is covering, kind of putting a veneer over everything. And that's it. It's just normally blank. In a few cases, you might have, like I've been to some kivas where there's sort of like a zigzag painted on the wall, but nothing else. It's very muted and very simplistic. Well, Pottery Mound blows that out of the water. At Pottery Mound, their kivas have incredibly elaborate murals depicting all kinds of scenes and people and deity figures and rain spirits and corn maidens and macaws. And people holding macaws, even a couple of species. It looks like probably Scarlet Macaws and also green-winged macaws from the looks of it based off of the head shape. And these people or deity figures, whoever they are holding these macaws. And they're prominent all over the place. This shows us just how important they were. We do not know why at Pottery Mound there was this profusion of expressive depiction. Again, part of it, we have to address the fact that this is very late. We know there was a lot of upheaval that went on in the Puebloan world towards the end of the kind of classic era. There's a lot of upheaval, a lot of droughts and different things that happen, and this will often necessitate a change of how people view the world and what deity figures they emphasize on. So we don't know for sure, but we know there was a shift, and this site stands out. Now, I have been to other sites. For example, there's a pueblo called River House that I went to, and in the kiva, I was looking around and noticed that, and in a couple of the rooms and in the kiva, there is evidence of paint and pigment. It's all worn mostly off, but you can see different pigments and different paint on the site, which I've never heard anybody mention before. So it is possible that some of these other sites may have also had a similar situation. We don't know for sure, but we know that at Pottery Mound there were these beautiful murals, and many of them featured macaws. I always love looking at these and just seeing, people holding them and seeing, having your arms spread out like this, whether this is a person, a shaman, a deity figure, but they're holding, two macaws. That's, arms spread out. It's kind of a sign of divinity, a sign of welcoming, a sign of expressing power, and having that, your hands then holding a couple of macaws. This is a very powerful icon. And I wish we could know exactly what the belief system was at this particular Pueblo site. Unfortunately, we don't. And a lot of looting and pot hunting happened in the early days in this site. Unfortunately, it's protected now, but it's sad to know what might have been lost. To my knowledge, no macaw bones have been found at this site. But again, in the early days, people were just viewing this as treasure hunting, and they were just digging through, tearing through, and trying to find whatever they could that they could turn around and sell. And, a couple of macaw bones aren't going to sell. So there could have been live macaws at the site, and we will likely never know. But it is important to note this site when you're trying to have a big, clear understanding of how macaws were used and viewed in the Southwest United States. It's very important to be aware of this site. It's hard to find any information about it, even if you go online, even on Wikipedia. There's very little in the common knowledge that's out there, which is sad. So people should be aware of this. I made a video specifically just on this site. I'll put a link to it in the description of this overall macaw video. But just remember, Pottery Mound, elaborate depictions of macaws, and if these were depicted in this way, and this prominently, even over eagles, the assumption would be that across the board, probably in the Puebloan world, macaws were on their mind in a very important and very prominent way. So that is just a little bit about the macaws depicted at Pottery Mound. Husbandry and Care. This is another very important section that I hope archaeologists access this particular segment, because very little of this information is in the common knowledge of most archaeologists. So the husbandry and care of macaws. These are considerations when you're trying to understand what happened in the ancient world. So first of all, macaws require a very rich diet. Now it's likely that they mostly, in these ancient pueblos, just had corn and pine nuts. These are not good for long-term diet. They can cause fat deposits to build up and can cause kidney issues. Now, we do feed some corn, a little bit of corn, to the palate of a macaw. Corn is very sweet. So you can give them a few kernels of fresh corn, you can give them a few kernels of dry corn, and it's a tiny supplement in what we feed macaws today, but it is not the majority. There is not too much else that macaws could have eaten in these Puebloan villages. There really is not. There's a few seed-bearing plants that were eaten, but mostly what was available for them to eat was corn and maybe pine nuts. And again, not very healthy. It is likely that macaws were very malnourished in these settlements. Most macaws from these sites, the archaeology has shown that they did not live past 2 years. This was likely, again, due to malnutrition. And after 1 year, you get full molted feathers. We do know that some macaws were ritually sacrificed, but we don't know if that was happening with all of them. But the point is, if you're getting a macaw at a young age, like I said in the area about the trade and the travel, if you're getting a macaw just weaned from its parents, but not yet able to fully fly, you ship it on foot, 700 miles, halfway on that journey, when the feathers hard pin, you rip out the primary feathers, and you continue on, and you trade it with these Puebloan people. And again, they're feeding it mostly really crummy food, and it's not going to live very long. Again, it's not going to live to 2 years. That seems to be what happens. Macaws typically mate for life, so that's another thing to factor in. When they're raised from their youth, they will pair bond with one person. Now, this has given some archaeologists the idea in their head that, a medicine man would go down to Mexico and would get a macaw and learn from a macaw trainer how to keep them and how to feed them, and then pair bond with them and then bring them back up. But again, the archaeology doesn't seem to show that. Again, the macaws that you see show signs of being malnourished and not growing very well and not living very well. But the fact that macaws pair bond with one person, they want to be with you 24/7. It's actually kind of obnoxious, and they will violently attack others because others represent a threat. I'll give you a story of that in just a minute. It's also important to remember that macaws bite each other in a mock food exchange. So a lot of times you go up and you're like, oh, I want to pet the bird, and it bites your finger. You're like, why did you bite me? That is how parrots say hello. Watch them. You're with your mate 24/7. You might go fly somewhere, but you're with your mate 24/7. And what they do is they'll come up to each other and they'll say hi by kind of biting each other's beaks. The beak is thick, it's hard, it's made out of keratin, same material as horn, and they bite each other's beaks. Well, why do they do that? Well, that is the appendage that they most navigate the world with. They can use their feet also like hands and hold things, but they far more use their beak and their tongue. If you ever see a parrot up close, they'll manipulate something. I had macaws that you give them a grape and they would skin the grape and chuck out the skin and eat just the grape itself. I mean, they're amazing what they can do with their tongue. It's quite surprising. But why is the biting thing so important? Well, parrots do mock food exchange. So remember, as a baby macaw, the parent is going to eat a bunch of food in the field. It's in the crop, and then they go up to the baby, and the baby opens its mouth, and they do this obnoxious motion, and they vomit up. It's not from the stomach, so it's from the crop. A crop is before the stomach. It's an organ right here. It's just basically a pouch. But so we say vomit up. Vomit is coming from your stomach with bile and stuff, but still it's gross to think about. But they'll spit up food from the crop into the baby's mouth, and the baby eats it. It's the same thing we have to do when we're hand feeding baby macaws, is we have to go through the same thing with a syringe. Well, that is bonding, because a parent and a baby do that, but mates do that to each other. They will go up and they'll be like, hey, look, we're a mated pair, and they'll like burp, 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 and they'll spit up a little bit of food to share, to be like, hey, look, this is a way of saying, I love you, I'm committed to you, we're still a pair. And I find this very interesting, because I had a pair of macaws. They weren't even the same species. I had a military macaw named Tikal, and I had a red-fronted macaw named Khaleesi. They were a mated pair, and they even had babies, hybrids, but they're still fertile offspring. And when I was doing some wildlife shows, and I would be flying Tikal across the room, and Khaleesi would start to freak out. It's like she's flying to him, and she was legitimately jealous, and she would start to scream, and she would scream, and then she would do the head motion of receiving vomited food. So she was like saying, you still love me? You still committed to me? And I would bring him over to her, and they would bite beaks, and they would do that motion without actually vomiting up food. So that very motion, it's kind of like holding hands for them in a way. So biting each other's beaks and doing those head motions are vital to normal parrot behavior. So you sticking your finger out is the equivalency of them sticking their beak out. Them biting you is not necessarily an act of an aggression. But when they want to be in aggression, they might be biting you because they love you. They might be biting you because you're a threat and you're representing a threat to the person they are pair bonded with. You got to remember that. Macaws are very messy eaters. They shred everything up. They shred everything to pieces. And when they do that, they leave a lot of mess down below. That attracts rodents. They also poop. They like to perch in one place and they poop down below. That brings a lot of small invertebrates and insects and rodents in again. So it's smelly having them around. It's incredibly messy having them around. So factor that in your understanding on anywhere these birds are being kept. So you don't want to be attracting insects, you don't want to be attracting rodents, and you don't want to have to deal with that kind of a mess. Something to factor in and consider when you're understanding these birds being kept in the ancient world. So in addition to being messy eaters and messy poopers, these birds are highly intelligent, very similar to a raven or a human. They need mental stimulation, and if they don't have that, they will self-harm. So again, if you have a macaw and you leave to go to work, they're like, my mate disappeared. They don't know where you went. They have no clue where you went. You're pair bonded with them and they start to get depressed, especially if you don't have something for them to do or something, and they feel like you abandoned them every day. You're abandoning them. And again, if they don't have mental stimulation, and if you're always abandoning them by their perspective, they're going to start to self-harm, including ripping out their own feathers. Some of them pluck their feathers so much that they do not grow back. How many macaws do you see like that in captivity? Sadly, a lot. That's something to also factor in. How was this managed in the ancient world, especially during the cold months? These are tropical birds. They're not desert birds. They're tropical birds, and these deserts have snow in the winter. They're very cold. So what do? Just keep them inside by a fire all the time? That doesn't sound like a lot of good visual and mental stimulation. Now, these birds also need to constantly tear apart things. Now, the reason for this is in the wild, they will go and tear apart open seed pods. Like a walnut is not wild in their area, but I love giving them walnuts, and they crack it open. They have this tick that they need to break things open and tear things apart, because again, that's what they're doing all day in the wild. And they'll open up a seed pod, use their tongue to manipulate it around, pull out the seed, and chuck it up. And they just like to shred. They also use it to wear down their beak. They also sharpen their own beak. The way their beak is angled, they resharpen the inside so it's a blade. With their lower mandible, they sharpen the base of the upper mandible. But they need to shred things and destroy things. That's what they're built to do. So in captivity, one of the things we do now is we make toys for them. You can buy them, but you also make them. And we'll just cut up tons of pieces of wood and rope and stuff and just tie them up, and they just shred them. Like you're having to go through 2 of those a week at least. And they just need to tear things apart. If they don't have that to do, then they're going to start tearing apart themselves. So again, this is a factor that is not normally thought about. They also eat clay in the wild. In the wild, scarlet macaws eat a lot of poisonous seed pods, a lot of poisonous nuts. And once they eat it, then they go fly to a certain part of the river that has clay. They eat the clay, and the clay neutralizes the poison in their body. So they are built and genetically wired to tear things apart and to eat clay. What are pueblos made out of? They're made out of some stone, but adobe clay and wooden beams. What the people were living in is the very things that macaws are genetically wired to tear apart. So how on earth do you keep a macaw happy and not tearing itself apart and not eating apart your home? Like literally, an adobe pueblo is the exact thing that a macaw wants to tear apart. They just see that and they got to pick at it. And so how are they kept? And again, we don't know where they were kept in the Mimbres region. We seems to be in Chaco that they were kept in some of the most internally enclosed rooms in the Pueblo. I would imagine, as far as that sort of husbandry, I would imagine that what was done is you would again have your adobe walls, but there were probably branches put across that they were allowed to stay on. Macaws will usually stay put. If you have a perch, they'll usually kind of stay put. They don't want to be on the ground like a cockatoo. They want to be up where you are, and you can put them up on something and they'll kind of stay there and hang around on it, but they're going to start chewing whatever is around it. Another thing about macaws is they are incredibly loud, and that call carries. I don't know the studies, but there's some decibel where like the pitch is similar to that of a jet engine or something. There's some study that was done on just how ridiculously loud that might, how many decibels hit your ear. But they're so loud, and they've got to be, because that's kind of like that Marco Polo thing, right? They always got to call for their mate. You're in a dense forest, you don't know where your mate is, but you're a mated pair, you got to stay together. And so they'll meow, 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 meow. And so a lot of people are like, oh, I got this parrot and it's so loud. Well, yeah, because you go to work and it's screaming for you. Where did you go? Where did you go? They think they abandoned you. So all day long, your bird thinks you abandoned it. And then you come home from work and they're like, oh, good, you're here. It's kind of rough on them. It really is emotionally rough on them. If they don't have another friend or another pair there where they feel together, that's rough on them. But that loudness is also used to alert for predators. So if there are predators that do hunt macaws, such as harpy eagles. Harpy eagles have these big, powerful, incredibly oversized feet that are able to dispatch a macaw quickly before it can turn around and bite their toe off, because you could literally bite off the toe of a harpy eagle. Macaws are that powerful. So again, for warning about predators and also finding out where your mate is, macaws are loud, and that could be really obnoxious. But that's also a positive thing potentially, because you got to think about it. If you are keeping a macaw and you're wanting to show off, I have a macaw, the fact that it's always loud, every time it screams, people are going to look over. It's drawing attention to the fact you're a wealthy elite who is allowed to have a macaw. Now, macaws can and do fly. Today we fly them with GPS. I've done it. There's a company here in Utah called Marshall Radio that has pioneered macaws, not only for falconry, or pioneered GPS not only for falconry, but also for macaws. And it's becoming a popular thing, is a group of people get together who have macaws and they'll fly them up and then call them all back. And it's actually really beautiful to see. We like that idea, but that's not reality. You're not going to be flying a macaw in some of these ancient Pueblos. Again, the archaeology shows they ripped out the primary feathers. You can see it on the bones themselves. The barbules are damaged. They were ripped out, and they were constantly kept in a ripped out state. So these birds were not flying around. Now, they could be kept on a perch in a social area. We don't have a way to verify that one way or another, but a person could come out with their macaw, set them on a perch. That's what I always did. I used to run bird shows at a place called Evermore. And in between shows, I just had these outdoor perches, and my birds could fly, but I just bring them out and just put them on perches and stand by them and let people come by and say hi to them. The macaws are happy. They love that. They love to be where that social energy is. So that's definitely a possibility. Macaws could have been brought out either for ceremonial purposes or just in general. You just bring your macaw out and show off with it. But again, it seems to indicate that they were sacred, but at least at Chaco, they seem to be very much an elitist thing, a way of showing your authority and your power, and associating with that color red, which again was a way to advertise political authority out of Mesoamerica. Most macaws do show that their feathers were ripped out. These do grow back every year. So if a macaw dies, you at least got one set of molted feathers in there, something to consider as well. Macaw enclosures in the Pueblo world would have just been stone, adobe, clay, and wood. So again, these things are not conducive to parrots. So I'm still at a loss at how they didn't just shred. So again, it took constant work. If you're having a live macaw in one of these Pueblos, these things are constantly trying to tear apart your housing. And it would have taken constant effort and constant repair. Or maybe people figured out, hey, we're going to constantly give them toys to shred apart. Maybe they figured that out. We're not sure. But that is something that needs to be factored in. Normally, people don't put up with that. If your dog's barking all day, you're like, I'm putting it outside. I can't stand this dog. It's barking nonstop. Well, a macaw, you can't put it outside in the winter. And if it's shredding your house, you might be like, I'm getting rid of this. But not for them. They were keeping them because these were high profile, high status animals that were brought in. And so you're going to put up with it doing something destructive like destroying your house. And you have to keep rebuilding that house. We also see that you could have kept them on a T-perch inside separate from things. Macaws do not like to get down on the ground. So if you have them on a perch, they don't want to get down and walk over to something else. Cockatoos love to do that. Macaws do not like to do that. So if you have a freestanding T-perch in a room, that could be a good way to keep them and keep them away from the adobe walls. That's good theory. Can't prove or disprove that, but that is likely, if they were wise and looked at the behavior over the years, that would be the best way to do it. Now at Paquime in Mexico, at the northwestern Mexico there, they had macaw breeding pens where they actually kept and bred macaws. How did they do that? We don't know. We're totally at a loss to know how they did that, because you look at these pens and what's left of them, and it's just adobe. It's like, how are the macaws not shredding these or getting out? We don't know, because the rest of the structure is gone. It's disintegrated. But we do know that they kept and bred macaws at Paquime. In this next segment, we're going to be talking to someone who currently has a military macaw. Now again, the three main birds that were kept in the American Southwest were scarlet macaws, military macaws, and thick-billed parrots. Well, military macaws, they're a beautiful species, and I've raised a lot of macaws myself. I've bred them, I've raised them, I've hand-fed them from babies, but it's always nice to get the perspective of somebody else who currently has a macaw right now. So we're going to do a little interview with Autumn Henry, and we're going to take a look and see what it's like, the pros and the cons and the ups and the downs of keeping a macaw in today's world. And again, this is one of the same species that were kept anciently by these Puebloan people.
All right. Well, hello, I'm Autumn, and this is my friend Koji. So Koji is a military macaw, and Koji and I have, I think, a pretty interesting history. So I am a bird trainer, and I used to work at a bird show down in Texas, and I met Koji there when he was 10 years old, and I was 24. So the second I saw him, I knew he was my soul animal. I immediately fell in love with him. I became one of his primary trainers, and we spent 5 years together at that show. However, I then got a job here in Utah, and so then I moved away from him, which was heartbreaking. It was sad. And so I was super gracious because my team would still include me. They would have him FaceTime me. He would get super excited because he recognized it was me on the phone. He sent me well wishes for my birthday when I was in a car accident. And then unfortunately, 2020 happened and COVID actually shut that bird show down. So they spent many months trying to figure out what they were gonna do now that they did not have a show and they had a lot of birds and not a lot of staff. So I actually shot my shot and I reached out and asked, hey, if you ever think about it, please think about adopting him out to me. And so I was very lucky because they actually said yes. So in October of 2020, I went on a road trip to go adopt Koji officially. So I had spent a lot of my time in that bird show telling people that I would never have a macaw as a pet. And that is still semi-accurate. It was just different because this was, like I said, an animal that I very much love and very much am obsessed with. So as I said before, kind of a soul animal. So some of the really cool things about him is that he does know a couple of behaviors. So do you want to wave everybody? Wave to everybody? It's kind of windy, so he's sort of not into it. We can maybe try them later too. So he does know a couple of behaviors that are super cool because he was from that show scenario, but it's always important to remember that was a bunch of professional bird trainers training him those behaviors. So even though he does know how to say some words, he knows how to do some fun, cool things, and sometimes he flies, that was because he had a bunch of people round the clock working with him to do those behaviors. The other cool thing that we got to do at that show was we got to leave at the end of the day. So we didn't hear him screaming. These guys communicate through screaming because they live in giant flocks. They love to yell at each other to tell each other where there's a predator, where there's food, maybe just something cool is over here. And so he does that with me now. He screams at his flock, which is myself as well as my friends and family. And sometimes it can just be a little overstimulating. So something that I always have to keep in mind with this animal, despite how loud I am and how loud I like us to be together, not always the best scenario, especially for apartment living or if you are after quiet hours out and about. But like I mentioned, he is just an absolute joy. We love to try new things with him. He actually is learning how to do some cool things right now. He learned how to say his name, which he had never done before. And then he also learned how to stretch out his wings on cue. And that's just really good enrichment for him. So they have the mentality of about a 3-year-old human child. So he does require constant things like training and other enrichment, stimulating sort of experiences to sort of make sure that he is happy and healthy. And that includes training with him. But like I mentioned, lots of negatives there. So they do scream very loud. They also have a really strong bite force. That bite force can actually break through a broom handle in some macaw species, and he has bitten me before. So the important thing to know about the macaw is that even though you can have a really good relationship with one, a lot of the times they are not going to be seeking out your approval, maybe like a dog would. Because a dog is fully domesticated, they want to make sure that you're happy as a person. Not to anthropomorphize, but that's pretty accurate. Meanwhile, the macaw is very much still a wild animal, and you know, it's not their fault that they're here and in captivity, but they still have those wild behaviors. So I have to listen really closely to Koji with what he's telling me with his body language and with other tiny signs that I can tell mean that he's uncomfortable, that he might be overstimulated and would equate to a bite. So the great news is that because I am so aware of his body language, I can avoid bites probably 95% of the time. But that other 5% of the time does equate sometimes in just bites that don't feel very good, and they hurt my soul and my physical body. So that is always something to remember, and it always feels sort of like a betrayal of trust when that happens, and it's so important for macaw owners to recognize that it's not the animal's fault and that they need to figure out what happened, make sure that doesn't happen again. And so that's what we do with Koji on a regular basis. He gets very excited, and then he doesn't quite know what to do, so he thinks, I'll just bite. Which, you know, who among us can say that hasn't happened? So he is definitely also very messy. These animals are gonna spend most of their day foraging for food, and they're actually seed dispersers, which is super important to the environment because it does help grow the rainforest where they are. Unfortunately, my carpet does not sustain life that way. So that is something that he has not found out yet though. So he does still toss food around. He's very messy. They poop about every 20 minutes, which is also super important to help grow plants in the rainforest. But once again, in a house, a lot more difficult. But another really cool thing about Koji that we love is we actually have a hiking club with him. We take him on hikes during the summer. And so we have a little club that we like to joke around and say, oh, come join the club. So we're working on making it more of an actual entity. But yeah, his Instagram is Green Bean Koji, Kogi. So make sure to check it out and follow him for his shenanigans as well as the Koji Hiking Club. You wave. You say hi? Hi. Good. What about hello? Hello. Good bird. So for animals like macaws, they do sometimes pair what they're saying with the situation. So he knows that hi is something that will get him a lot of attention from me if he says it to me first thing in the morning. Yeah, is that funny? Yeah. And so he does often recognize the context clues for when to say something. It doesn't necessarily mean he knows what he's saying. However, a lot of the times it is just mimicking. Can you give me a kiss? Thank you. What's your name? That's not it. What's your name? Is it Koji? What's your name? Good bird. There you go. So that's his new behavior we've been working on. So he's not super clear with it yet. And macaws are also not the best talkers of the parrot world. So it's very important to know if you're getting any bird, even an African gray, which is well known for its ability to mimic, it does not mean that they're going to do that because it's very much an individual behavior as well. Can you show us your wings? Good job. What about, can you dance? Dance, 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 dance. Good boy. And then you'll notice I'm giving him a piece of reinforcement every couple of behaviors, huh? Yeah. What about, do you like carrots? Yeah, that's icky. So he gets his high value reinforcers, which in this case are his pellets. Huh. Are you afraid of heights? Yeah, so scary. And then can you sing? La la la. La 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 la. La. What about, can you be Megan the Stallion? Bah. Bah. Good board.
Breeding macaws. Well, macaws, we know for a fact, were brought up from Mexico and were transported and delivered to these Pueblo and different peoples. But we know that at Paquime in Mexico, which is also called Casas Grandes, Paquime, Casas Grandes are the same thing. Now, Casa Grande is a different site. Don't get those mixed up. But Casas Grandes or Paquime, I call it Paquime, is this epic site, this trade hub where everything on Earth was coming up from the south, moving up from the north. Incredible place. The amount of wealth going through there is mind-boggling. Rooms that are filled from floor to ceiling with shells or floor to ceiling with turquoise. And again, live macaws went through here, but macaws were bred there. Now, Paquime, its kind of heyday was from 1130 AD to 1450 AD. So it's going a lot later than a lot of these other sites that I've talked about in this video. Now, Paquime is part of the Mogollon culture. The Mimbres culture is not part of this. So Mimbres is a region that is part of the Mogollon culture. And I talked about it earlier. If you've watched the whole video, Mimbres is Mogollon, but Mogollon is not necessarily Mimbres. So Paquime is really kind of the zenith, the biggest, the most elaborate profusion of Mogollon culture. Parrots were kept and shipped north from there. Macaws and turkeys were also bred there. And the macaw breeding pens, again, our big question is how do they not destroy them? We see these, and there's proof of aviculture. And it's very similar to some of the modern day macaw breeding pens that we have, the layout and the way it's used. So really the pioneering of aviculture in the Americas took place at Paquime from 1130 AD to 1450 AD. I would love to hear more people's theories. I have not gotten the chance to go to Paquime myself, and I would love to inspect these breeding pens. As a former macaw breeder, I would love to see them firsthand, or would love any archaeologists in the comments to comment who have been there. What have you seen? What is it like? What are your theories on how they kept macaws from utterly destroying these structures and being able to breed in this kind of environment? It's a fascinating thing to consider. But again, the important thing to remember is that throughout all this time, macaws were shipped up from Mexico, but from 1130 AD to 1450 AD, Paquime was actually breeding macaws and shipping them northward. We've gone through all this about macaws, but one thing we have not yet talked about is why they were so spiritually valuable and what they kind of represented. So in the southwestern United States and northwestern Mexico, macaws most certainly represented three things. They represented wealth, which only the elites had them. They represented power. And think about it, the ability to lead or order people to bring macaws from the south to you from 700 miles away on foot, that requires power to do so. And they represented spiritual authority. We do not know exactly what macaws meant in Mesoamerica and in the Southwest, but we do know that they were deeply spiritually significant. Therefore, owning a macaw or even being seen holding one automatically gave you spiritual authority and religious clout and religious credit. Macaws had spiritual value in Mesoamerica. This came north with the people who came north. We know that red was a color and scarlet was painted all over the pyramids, covering kings' bodies. In fact, we have at very many of the Mayan burials, some of the greatest kings in the Mayan pantheon were buried with cinnabar, red cinnabar, and they were just covered with, their bodies were covered with it, and their entire sarcophagus, their entire entombment chamber was covered with this red cinnabar, which is very striking. And so we know that red had an association with sacredness and with divinity and with authority. Bright, vibrant scarlet colors, we also know, are associated with the concept of children of the sun. We know after the fall of the Aztec Empire that even today, Pueblo people have this idea of the solar youth, which is, there's a deity figure called Xochipilli, and he's often depicted with a Scarlet Macaw, headdress. And there are Pueblos today that have lasted to today and still have people living in them that still have big old scarlet feather totems representing the solar youth that they bring out during certain times of year. And some of these feathers are like a few hundred years old that are still on these kind of totemic displays. So there is an association with the sun, association with color, with vibrance that we see that's carried on. But one of the most important things to remember is that macaws can talk. Macaws can talk. And what on earth would that do for people? We know today that certain animals can talk. We understand that scientifically. And people are like, oh, they're just mimicking. Well, no, ravens, crows, magpies, and parrots absolutely learn what they're meaning. And some people try to downplay it. It's like, oh, you teach them what this thing means. Well, they're just associating and attaching a meaning to the word. Yeah, that's what language is. You know, if I say, you know, that this is a pen and you say pen, and next time I hold up and you say pen, yeah, you learned what it meant. So parrots even have ridiculous senses of humor. I've had cockatoos that will play with people where they'll try to scream at kids, but they'll coax them in there like, pretty girl. They'll say pretty girl and try to get these little kids to come over. And when the kids get right by the cage, they start screaming and banging their head against the cage, making the kid cry. And then they walk up to the top of the cage and they start laughing a human laugh. They understand it's funny. This is funny to tease kids, apparently. So parrots are highly intelligent. And the fact that they learn how to talk, in the Southwest, there could have been nothing like that. What can prepare you for an animal that can speak your language? Talk about spiritual power. The amount of medicine that would represent is unimaginable. And we even have, we do have historic from the early 1900s records where, you know, anthropologists visiting current pueblos, and they have a thick-billed parrot, and the parrot speaks that language. It speaks Zuni, and so that's an important factor in, is that these birds learn how to talk. They are loud, and the sound draws attention. So always remember that if you have wealth and you have authority and you have spiritual power, you want to draw attention to that. People put a cross or a steeple on top of their building, right? We know that copper bells were very valuable. Why not just have a plate of copper? Well, copper bells make a sound. So you hear the jingle, you look, you're hearing, but you're also seeing, but you're hearing, and it draws attention to that wealth and that authority. These special copper bells were shipped in from the South. How valuable? Well, same thing macaws. Every time a macaw screeches or screams, everybody's going to look over and notice and be like, oh, wow, that person has that wealth. It's like, look at me, look at me, look at me. So even though normally we view the screaming of a macaw as a bad thing, I think it also actually helped these people trying to promote whatever these macaws symbolized for them. Now, also as part of the spiritual value of macaws, I mentioned this earlier, but if you're looking at this video in segments, you may not have gotten this before. Some archaeologists have mythologized the idea of a medicine man going and taking a journey down to Mexico, learning from a macaw trainer, and then taking that knowledge back up and taking a macaw they got themselves. I think this is not only improbable, but almost demonstrably impossible, because adult macaws would not take that journey back. And we know that the macaws, once they are along the journey, their primary feathers were ripped out. So I think it's a highly implausible. It's a beautiful idea, but it just seems highly unlikely if you understand all the husbandry that goes into upkeep and care and trying to transport. There's no way you're transporting an adult macaw back. It will shred whatever you're hauling it in. It will not be contained. And again, we talked earlier, T-doors are a very powerful symbol, and I've done videos on that, and I'll do some more in-depth videos on that. But some people have put out there the idea that these T-doors were designed for macaws to fly through all these rooms, but it's not the case. Some of these macaws, when they fly, they pull in their wings. If they're tucking in to go through an area, flapping is not like this. People animate birds flapping like this, but then that pushes you up, pushes you down, pushes you up. They flap and they tuck in, okay? And they fly like this, but if they go through a narrow area, they pull their feathers, their wings completely in and go through. So you would not have to have special doors for a macaw to fly through. I could fly a macaw through an opening that wide. You know, a wingspan is, you know, like this, and I can fly them through an opening that wide, because they'll come up to it and then they'll tuck in and let their momentum carrying through. So that's a fallacy. That's not what T-doors were for. Now, again, the evidence shows that these macaws were malnourished. The primary feathers were ripped out, and they were kept in the deepest, darkest places, Pueblo Bonito, at least in the winter for sure. So that's important to factor that in as well on how these birds are trapped. But we know that macaws were hugely valued and considered sacred in the Northwest United States and the Southwest Mexico, at least since 600 AD. the descendants of these ancient tribes still hold them in deep regard. The Native American Church, which is an official church, utilizes macaw fans as part of their ceremony and their ritual. And Pueblos today still have feathers where they do ceremonies with macaw feathers. They are considered very sacred. So again, the culture hasn't changed. The culture of Southwestern tribes still greatly reveres scarlet macaws, even though it's a species not native to their area. And because of this, macaws are very hard to get. Macaws are expensive. They are insane. They're thousands of dollars. So for Native Americans to get feathers, or a body or skin of one, it's near impossible. So in recent years, there's been kind of a network that's made where they've tried to connect macaw owners with Native American tribes, and there's sort of an agreement where like, hey, if you have your macaw dies of old age, could you please donate it to these tribes so they can use it for these religious ceremonies, because there's no way they're otherwise going to be able to have access to some of these feathers or a skin of one of these. So it's pretty interesting to see. So to kind of conclude this, I've gone all over with this. This video has covered so many things, but I hope that you have learned a lot from it. I hope it's valuable. I hope you'll share it with other people, and that you will be able to have a better idea of what it took to trade macaws, to transport macaws, what it takes to upkeep a macaw. And hopefully we dispelled some of the myths about the Macaw Trade, and hopefully open your eyes to just how vast it was. The fact that there's hundreds of villages that had live macaws. That's absolutely incredible, remarkable, and should be better known. So hopefully this video helps to get that information out there. I love macaws. Again, I've had many macaws, many different species. I love working with them. I normally do not keep them unless I have a job situation where I can have them at my job, or where I'm teaching with them every day, because they require so much help and so much attention. And if they don't have it, they often self-harm, which is no fun. So this video took me several months of research, and again is accumulation of years and years and years of experience. So I hope if you can support me on this. If you subscribe to my channel, I very much appreciate it. Videos like this, I'm not getting paid to do this, so trying to get this kind of information out, because I just see lecture after lecture where people are making understandable assumptions about macaws and the macaw trade without the knowledge that I've provided in this video. So hopefully you can share it and find it useful. And yeah, always remember that life is a gift. So never stop learning and never stop exploring. We'll see you next time.